You probably picture the Old West cattle ranch the way every Western film ever made has shown it. A lone rider on a sun-bleached plain, stampeding longhorns, a cook fire at dusk, the romantic frontier where the work was simple, the land was free, and the smart ones got rich. That's the version of the story you're carrying around in your head, and it isn't wrong, exactly. It's just missing every part that actually mattered. Here's the problem. The story we were never told about Old West ranching wasn't written on the trail. It was written in the ledgers, on invoices from the railroads, on the books of Scottish and English banks that lent money to American cattle syndicates in the 1880s. The thing that made or broke a cattle ranch in the Old West wasn't bravery, range savvy, or even whether you had good grass. It was arithmetic. 5, 6, sometimes 7-figure arithmetic, decided by whether you couldn't predict and markets you couldn't control. The economics are where the real story lives. 10 million head. That is the number most commonly cited in Texas state historical records for the cattle that moved north out of Texas between 1867 and the end of the open range era. 10 million head of longhorn cattle, walking roughly 1,000 miles to stockyards most of them would never come back from. The version of the Old West with the cattle ranch at its center is a 25-year economic phenomenon, not a story about cowboys. Between about 1866 and 1890, that is the era we are talking about, somewhere between 5 and 10 million cattle were driven north from Texas into the Plains states, Wyoming, Montana, and the Dakotas. That mass movement happened because of 3 converging pressures that already existed before the first trail boss ever swung a leg over a horse. The Civil War had just ended. Texas was overrun with lean, feral, unbranded cattle that had multiplied uncontrolled for almost a decade. And the demand in the industrializing Northeast and across the Atlantic had effectively no ceiling. Beef was scarce. Beef was expensive. Beef was gold. Which brings us to the question that has to drive the rest of this video, because every story about Old West ranching ultimately pivots on it. How did a cattle ranch in the Old West actually make money? Not the campfire version, not the movie version, the version that required the rancher, or his backers, to actually balance a column of figures at the end of the year and not go broke. 3 drivers. That is the framework. Every Old West ranching operation that survived, and the much larger number that didn't, was being pushed and pulled by 3 forces at once. The cost of acquiring the animal, the cost of keeping it alive long enough to sell, and the price the market paid on the day of sale. None of those 3 could be controlled by the rancher. All 3 had to land in the same direction at the same time for a profit to exist. That's the lens, and we'll apply it now. First angle, the Texas succession. We start south, in Texas, because that's where the supply side of the entire system was being generated. By the late 1870s, John Simpson Chisholm, the man later referred to as the cattle king of the Pecos, was running over 80,000 head along the Pecos River in Lincoln County, New Mexico, drawn up out of Texas after the war. Not 8,000, 80,000. One rancher's herd. The families and operations clustered around him were operating at similar scale. Samuel Maverick's family, for example, had been collecting unbranded cattle, animals that, by way of his name, gave us the word maverick you still use today, since the 1850s. A neighbor in one much-cited story even paid off a $1,200 debt to the Maverick family in cattle at $3 per head. $3 a head. That is the entry price on a longhorn in 1850s Texas. From the rancher's standpoint, the animal was almost free. Grass was free. Land was effectively free, since there was no enforceable property regime on the open range yet. So the cost of acquiring and growing the herd was, theoretically, close to zero. Here's the catch the surface story skips. The cost of moving it to where the money was. A trail crew in this era cost around $500 a month to operate, according to historical accounts of trail outfits. A trail boss could make as much as $100 a month. Expert cowboys, $100 to $150. The hands underneath them were pulling $25 to $40. Rations, horses, lost cattle, lost equipment. Multiply that out across the months of a drive. Then add the shrink, the cattle that died on the trail, strayed, or were stolen. Industry estimates for the era put trail losses at anywhere from 2 to 5% of the herd, and that was considered normal. Cost of acquisition, near zero. Cost of delivery, significant. Margin on a 1,000-head drive was held together by arithmetic this thin. Second angle. The Pacific Rancher. Then came Henry Miller, a German immigrant who had landed in San Francisco in 1847 and worked his way up from a butcher's apprentice into the largest private landowner in California. By the 1880s, Miller controlled somewhere between 700,000 and 1,400,000 acres outright. Historical sources vary, with grazing leases pushing his effective reach past 3 million acres. His fortune at the peak was estimated at $25 million in then-dollar terms. Miller had solved a problem most Texas ranchers didn't have. California was fenced. California had deeded Spanish and Mexican land grants that could be bought for roughly $1 an acre and consolidated. He wasn't operating on the open range. He was building an industrial cattle operation with breeding land, hay reserves, slaughterhouses, and direct contracts with San Francisco buyers. The economics were different. The cost of acquisition was higher. The cost of keeping the herd alive was dramatically lower because he controlled the land. The price he could command at sale was steadier because he had a year-round market within driving distance. Miller was the version of Old West ranching that didn't depend on a 1,000-mile gamble. His model was, own the land, own the feed, own the buyer. Most ranchers couldn't do that. He did. Third angle. The British bet. Now we cross the Atlantic, because the single most fascinating chapter of Old West ranching economics runs through London and Edinburgh bank parlors. Between roughly 1879 and 1889, British and Scottish banks, syndicates of upper-class investors, and partnerships named things like the Anglo-American Cattle Company and the New England-backed Bay State Cattle Company began pouring capital into Wyoming, Montana, and the Western Territories. By 1876, Britain was importing roughly 1,732 tons of American beef, and a meaningful share of it traced back to Wyoming ranges. The math, as it was being sold from London drawing rooms, looked immaculate. Land was cheap. Cattle were cheap. Eastern and European markets were paying premium prices. American railroads would carry the product east. Wrap the whole thing in the language of free grass and high prices, and the projected returns on paper were breathtaking. Land could be leased from the state for pennies per animal per month. A steer that cost $3 or $4 in Texas could be sold in Chicago for 10 times that, sometimes more. The rate of return on paper was not 10% or 20%. It was the kind of number that makes a gentleman investor reach for his checkbook. British aristocrats, novelist-like characters in their own right, some of them dukes and earls, became absentee owners of American cattle ranches they had never visited and would never visit. The Wyoming boom of the early 1880s coincided with the 1880 census, counting 457 farms and ranches in the territory. By the middle of the decade, that number was rising fast. This is where the framework starts to explain the ending. The British syndicates had crushed driver number 1, cheap acquisition. They had held driver number 2, keeping the herd alive, to a manageable forecast. They had set their eyes on driver number 3, sale price, based on the assumption that the high prices Chicago and the East were paying during the early 1880s would simply continue. That assumption was load-bearing, not a soft guess. The load-bearing wall of the entire speculative structure. Then came 1886. Here's the hidden mechanism, the structural truth that explains everything downstream. Open-range ranching in the 1880s did not fail because of bad business judgment in the ordinary sense. It failed because the entire economic model was running on one input that nobody could price in advance, whether operating against a balance sheet that had been built assuming good years forever. In the early 1880s, the climate was mild. Grass was abundant. Cattle multiplied. The market was bullish. So more cattle were added. More syndicates formed. More British capital arrived. By the mid-1880s, the plains were overstocked to a degree that no contemporary observer could see from inside the model they were using. The number of head on the range was no longer a question of how much grass there was. It was a question of how much grass there was in the worst possible year the climate could produce. A normal rancher in Wyoming in 1885 thought about average winter. The model assumed average winter. The climate, in 1886, did not. Then came the winter of 1886 to 1887. The historians call it the Big Die-Up. Some estimates were lower, calibrated to reassure the investors in London. But most ranchers on the ground put their losses between 50 and 90% of their herds. The Northern Front Range in Colorado took losses around 25%. Crook and Carbon counties in Wyoming lost roughly 25%. Wyoming overall, according to historian T.A. Larson's reckoning, lost about 15% of its herd in that single winter. Statewide across the affected region from Montana south to Texas, hundreds of thousands of cattle, conservatively between 200,000 and over 1 million, depending on the source you trust, simply froze and starved to death on the range. Many panhandle ranches recorded 75% loss. The figures are not in dispute at the order of magnitude level. They are in dispute by tens of thousands of head, because the men filing the loss reports had reasons to either minimize or maximize them. Which brings us to the hidden structural fact about the entire Old West cattle economy. The operating leverage on a steer was extraordinary. A cattle rancher in 1885 might have an asset he paid $4 to acquire, that he planned to sell for $30 or $40 in Chicago, with the freight and the trail covered by the spread. That is roughly a 10-to-1 exposure. A rancher who put $40,000 of capital into 10,000 head was operating a notional position worth $300,000 to $400,000. From the perspective of the speculator, this was thrilling. From the perspective of the cattle, the position was 11 months of weather, plus a 1,000-mile march, plus market timing on arrival. From the perspective of the British investor in Edinburgh, all of that was hidden behind a tidy annual statement. So what actually determined who survived and who didn't? Not skill, in the way the myth of the frontier tells it. Geography. By the strict economy of that winter, a rancher in California who owned his land and had winter feed was largely insulated. Henry Miller's empire lost animals, but he also had hay, shelter, irrigated pasture, and a slaughter capacity that turned dying cattle into salvageable value. He survived the era intact, and his fortune roughly doubled during the decade that destroyed his contemporaries to the east. By contrast, an open-range operator in Wyoming, even a careful one, had no hay reserve of any meaningful scale, no shelter, and no control over the grass. The single most important variable in his entire cost structure was the one thing he couldn't price and the one thing he couldn't hedge. Which means, by any conventional analysis, the syndicates should have collapsed when the climate did what climates do. They did. Most of them. Here is where the human cost has to be recorded in the same breath as the figures, because the figures were people. The British syndicates wiped out large fractions of aristocratic fortunes. Reports from the period describe Scottish and English investors losing the equivalent of their country estate's yearly income in a single winter on animals that grazed on a continent they would never see. The smaller American ranchers who had stretched to buy in during the boom, many of them taking on debt on the assumption that prices would hold, found themselves, in the spring of 1887, technically bankrupt. Thousands of working cowboys and ranch hands lost their positions. Some moved on. Some drifted. Some died of exposure in the same winters that killed the cattle they tended. The cowboy who, in 1884, was earning $25 to $40 a month, that is the figure most often cited for working hands in the 1880s, was, by 1887, confronting an industry that had just lost half of the asset base it had been paying him to manage. The cascade did not stop with the ranchers. It hits the freight forwarders, the saloon keepers, the town merchants, the homesteading farmers moving in around the same time as the boom. They were all exposed to the same single variable gamble. Then comes the second half of the structural truth, the part that hadn't been visible in the mythological version of the Old West at all. Joseph Glidden patented the first practical design for what we now call barbed wire in 1874. From a market perspective, the invention looks small. From an economic architecture perspective, it was a controlled demolition. Production of barbed wire went from roughly 10,000 pounds in 1874 to 80,500,000 pounds by 1880. That 8,000-fold expansion in 6 years is not a marketing story. It reflects the collapse of the open range as a property system. As soon as land could be fenced cheaply, the free grass assumption that the British syndicates had been underwriting began to dissolve underneath them. The Texas trails were closed, in many cases, by wire. The northern ranges got fenced in. Open range ended as a working economic institution in part because the cost of fencing had fallen to where any homesteader could afford to do it. The market didn't kill open-range ranching. The market changed the price of excluding your neighbor from your grass. By the time the wire arrived, the cattle boom was already overdetermined. The winter of 1886 simply pulled the last pin. So where does the money actually come from? And where did it go? It comes from arbitrage between a low-cost acquisition environment and a high-price sale market, hedged by nothing but the assumption of a normal climate. It went, in the end, to the people who owned their land, owned their feed, and owned their buyer. To the operators who, like Henry Miller in California, had converted the ranch from a range bed into an industrial process. To the railroads, who were the only party that collected a freight fee on every head, in both directions of the cycle, regardless of who won and who lost. To the investors who got in early enough to be paid out before the 1886 reset. Almost nowhere else. Most of the wealth that the Old West cattle ranch is popularly believed to have created was, on the underlying ledgers, wealth that flowed through the ranches on its way to other hands. The deeper lesson hides in plain sight here. A business whose entire margin sits between one cost you can't fix and one price you can't control, with the entire structure built on the assumption that the variable in between will behave, is a business that has not been priced for its worst year. It has been priced for its average year, or its best year. That's true when the cattle are walking north out of Texas in 1884. It's true when capital is being pooled into instruments whose returns are assumed on the strength of a climate cycle that has never been tested at scale. The Old West cattle ranch didn't fail because individual ranchers were reckless. It failed because the model they had inherited assumed normalcy, and normalcy is the one thing no system gets to keep forever. The next time you see an industry whose profitability is built on the assumption that conditions won't change, and whose operators claim the conditions have never changed, listen for the cost column they aren't talking about. 40 degrees below zero, on the open range, with nothing between your herd and the wind but wire. That's the version of the math that didn't make it into the story.